and correspondent Bakari Sellers.
Good afternoon. What time is it? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How's everybody doing today? How is everybody doing today? All right, I got to make sure I can see everybody. Shout out to everybody at Demand Justice. In the words of the great American poet, Sean Carter, also known as Jay-Z, you could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here today. And so I'm from the big city of Denmark, South Carolina, where we have 3 stoplights and a blinking light. And my mom and dad would always tell me the 2 most important words in the English language are the words thank you, and they're not nearly said enough. And so before I introduce my guests for this conversation, I think we should all say thank you to Brian Fallon. Give him a round of applause. And again, thank you for everyone who's here. My guest today is none other than a good friend and even a hero. It's amazing when you can call someone a hero. Down south, and no, DC is not the South, and we'll have a whole conversation about whether or not Virginia is the South at a later time. But we have this saying that you should give people their flowers while they're living. And I think we should give Martin Luther King III his flowers while he's living. He is the son, the oldest son of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And with all due respect, my true hero, his mom, Coretta Scott King. Martin Luther King III, please join me on stage. Oh, I'm already messing up. Are you in that seat over there, apparently? This may be the only time I'm to the left of you. I don't know. So we're going to have fun. We don't have a lot of time. The producers have already talked to me in my ear and told me that this is live TV. Brian said that he asked Don Lemon to host it, and this is what y'all got today. So this is as close to Don Lemon as you could get. So how you feeling today first?
Pretty good. Hope everybody's doing well, and always good to, well, I won't say always, but to be in Washington. I appreciate Brian inviting us, and just happy to be here.
You know, one of the questions that I wanted to start with, and pardon me for being decently cheesy, but I would always tell folk that the second best piece of writing by your father was this very small book entitled Where Do We Go From Here? And when we ask these questions of how far have we come and where do we go from here, can you give us the 50,000 foot view on where you think we are as a country in terms of democracy and its fragility, and where do we go from here?
I will attempt to, but let me add one dynamic to that, because where do we go from here is so prophetic, because the latter part of the title is
Chaos or Community.
Chaos or Community. We've been living in chaos for quite a long time, and probably didn't see it happening. Yeah, because, we elected our first African-American president back in 2009. Well, he served in 2009, 2008, I guess. And so, we thought we were just making great strides. And yet, all of the years that President Obama served, as it relates to progressive policies, things started really turning from when he was from when he was elected. So the other thing that happened is, once President Trump was elected and began his tenure of being president during that time, so many things just have gone backward. It's not even, it really is just backward. And it's almost perplexing, but it shouldn't be if you understand what's happening. There's this huge fear around the world because, I think that there's some European Americans who feel we're getting ready to lose everything, because you're not going to be able to stop.
White folk.
Yeah, you said, yeah, that's what I mean. That's exactly what I mean. That's basically all it is. So the fear that Blacks and Latinos are quickly going to take over the country is looming large, and it creates these reactions that cause us to move backward. When in any time in history have laws been put in place to move backward? Right. we've always used the law to expand. Now we're going backward. That's why we got to expand the court.
Well, thank you for bearing. We got the answer we needed. We're done with the discussion. I guess we weren't going to try to bury the lead and lead them into this. But let's talk about the role of the Supreme Court in all of this. In South Carolina, where I'm from, where we all have family from, people's roots go back to South Carolina. 1949 was Briggs v. Elliott, which was the first case in the landmark collection of cases known as Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. We've always seen the Supreme Court kind of play a role, but something has, or play a role in progress, but something has happened and something has changed. And so talk to me about where you see the Supreme Court today when we talk about the fragility of democracy or the erosion of democracy, and what has changed?
Well, the court was an area where many of us went for relief.
Yeah.
Now the court seems to be providing pain to a lot of people, whether it's around voting rights. I mean, we have not so far been able to expand voting rights. We obviously hugely, the Dobbs decision just took us back over 50 years. And the question is, what's next? And that's what is also very frightening, because there are a number of rights that can be turned back also, and probably will. I mean, Justice Thomas told us himself. Only one he didn't talk about
was loving.
Yes. So people should find that interesting. But nevertheless, that's the way things are moving. I think we're in a phase where the court is out of line with what the nation believed, based on, if polling is correct, that the court is way out of line. And again, it goes back to, what are your remedies? Expansion. Some people probably believe that the Constitution states that there must be 9 justices, and that has nothing to do with it. I think so. There's a process that we have to quickly educate people to understand. Then also, initially, I think there were 9 appellate court. Circuit court, excuse me. Now there's 13.
Correct.
And each justice, some are overseeing 1 or 2.
Correct.
And so to address it, that's another reason why we need to expand the court. And the time is right now.
When we talk about the court and we talk about people like Chief Justice Warren, or we talk about Thurgood Marshall, for example, I firmly believe one of the cruelest things ever done to the poor, people of color, oppressed in this country, was replacing Thurgood Marshall with Clarence Thomas. That's my own personal opinion. I don't think it's talked about enough. But when we look at this court in particular, and you mentioned Dobbs, for example, that was the first time, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the first time in the history of the court where they actually took away a protected right from a group. And Brian am I right or wrong? They're nodding. So we're going to scratch that. We're going to edit that out. But
certainly in recent years.
But let's talk about the messaging around it, and how do we make this an issue that we talked about in the back there, meeting people where they are. How do we talk about the import of the court, expanding the court? How do we talk about this on a grassroots level so that people in the barbershop, the beauty salons, the grocery stores, the people who are working 9 to 5s, who don't watch CNN, but maybe listen to a podcast here or there, they watch the Commanders. I don't know why anybody would, but talk about those individuals, and how do we meet them where they are with the messaging about the court?
So I think we have to use every medium that exists, from social media, really starting with social media, because that's where a lot of young folk are and live. And it's amazing to me. Every week, my daughter comes to me with something that I didn't. I'm like, how do you know? Where'd you get this from? We don't teach you this. And it's really quite informative. So, I mean, if we are living through those channels, that's how you begin to inform people, because again, that's where people are. But they do have to understand how these things affect you directly on your street, in your neighborhood, how, and in any of the issues that the courts deal with, because some of them are very complex. Although, you know, let me talk about Citizens United, because it's hard to understand how you say a corporation can just give unlimited money and has the same power as you or I. It doesn't. So that should not have been uplifted, in my opinion. And it's got to be repealed some way. But the only way you can repeal it is you got to have more justices on the court. And the other logic, since you have 13 appellate courts and 9 justices, why would we not have 13 justices? 4 more added to the court could make a dramatic difference. But it also, most importantly, is where the people are. When you do polling, people believe many things, but the court only believes something very narrow and limited. And of course, the court's supposed to decide these narrow and limited issues. But by the same token, you know, the court can, in some ways, lead us and not, again, restricting is what is bothering me, that we are restricted by a group of women and men in a way that's beyond terrible and so hard to repair. If we don't do anything, things are going to get even worse. And at some point, then there will be some kind of reaction. I think the most important thing I'm concerned about, or one of the most important things, not just as it relates to the courts, is the climate that may cause the nation to go into a different spin. The issue of guns. Now, you know, all of you know my dad was killed, but you probably don't know that my grandmother was gunned down in the church while playing the Lord's Prayer back in 1974. So I lost a father and a grandmother to gun violence. And yet, you know, none of that hurts very deeply, but it didn't tarnish who I am and who I think my family has tried to talk when it comes to forgiveness. I mean, we have to find a way to move forward. But the solution is not letting people get more guns. I mean, that is asinine. Violence cannot put out violence. Something else has to exist. Another kind of energy has to exist to transform and change our society. I mean, in Georgia, our governor passed a law and signed a bill a few months back. You don't even have to register anymore in Georgia. Anybody can get a gun. So, you know, whether you're a criminal or not, now it's like...
You have to register to vote. Which is decently
interesting. That's right. That's right. That's the craziest thing. But again, the courts are siding with those like Georgia. Now, at some point, it's going to have severe, every day it feels like it's having significant consequences, but it's going to be even worse.
And so let's say we have these conversations at the barbershop, et cetera. We just saw Donald Trump, who, again, lost the popular vote, but nominated 3 justices. How do we get this message? And I think the only person who I see talking about it, well, I won't be that critical, but how do we get this message to Capitol Hill? How do we get this message to the White House? How do we convince these individuals who may not find it to be? And frankly speaking, Brian and I were talking about this in the back. For decades, Democrats didn't even talk about the federal judiciary. It wasn't a sexy issue for us. You know, we have famous quotes from Barack Obama's chief of staff about just, you know, not giving it floor time. I mean, we saw that it was a huge issue in 2016 for the Republicans, but not a huge issue for Democrats. Not the candidate, but the electorate. Mm-hmm. So how do we get that message there? I don't know where the Capitol is, but just imagine that's where I'm pointing, in some vicinity around here. How do we get it there?
It always starts with mobilizing and organizing, which has always been the way that anything was done. We worked on a campaign, and I want to look at it positively as opposed to negatively. The negative part is that we didn't succeed. That was to get the John Lewis voting rights bill passed and other pieces of legislation to protect and expand democracy and the right to vote, which is a fundamental right that we all have. Well, the mobilization of what we and others did ended up having, 48 members of Congress ready to dismantle the filibuster. We needed, of course, 50 plus one, and yet we did not succeed. But we didn't start off, with 48. It took time to get to that.
I remind folk all the time, you just have those two out there taking the brunt, because there are a lot of other United States senators that are not on board with many of the issues that we are on board with.
And today, and we're not, but yet there's something that begins to move Congress at a certain point. I think, these midterms are beyond critically important. None of us can predict what's going to happen. The pollsters, by and large, predicted something different in 16, and yet many of them were wrong. So I don't know. I don't think we have to depend on pollsters. We've got to really organize at the community level, at the grassroots level, every day, putting out messaging and informing people of what the truth is. The problem is the truth keeps changing, and it's very confusing. It really is complicated, but it can be more simple. So we have to simplify it so that everyone in a neighborhood can understand what the consequences are. I think many people don't.
Can I chime in real quick and just ask this question? Because one of the things I hear from my friends who are in politics, a lot of Black folk in particular, is the fear of expanding the court, and it's a fear rooted in this slippery slope. Like, if we expand the court and we do this on our watch, what can happen next? It's kind of like my fear of opening up the Constitution. Like, people want new constitutional amendments, and I'm like, I'm not sure I want to let these folk back in the Constitution, right? I'm just a little nervous about that. So how do we assuage and how do we calm that fear?
I think information is power.
Yeah.
And the problem is people really don't have the information. I mean, you can be a very wealthy person and the stock market crashes, but you didn't know it was going to crash. You're done. But if you knew that there was a potential, then you could at least plan and structure. So I'm just saying, I think the real issue is we have not yet figured out how do we get a message through that people understand the consequences. If folks understood the consequences, they would vote in every election. I think that's the biggest issue. And it all revolves around, well, how does this really affect me?
Correct.
I have not seen my lifestyle change in 30 years, and politicians come and make promises and nothing changes. The issue is anything around change is like a massive ship. A ship needs to change its course like now. Well, it's going to take a while for that ship to move. And unfortunately, people are tired of waiting. They don't have the capacity to wait. But again, if you expose and document how things have happened and how there has been progress made, I think people are willing to, to give you a minute at least.
So what are some of the things that you're doing around this particular issue in the future? And I would like for you to spend a moment and talk about your institute and talk about some of the things that you're doing, because some people may not know what you're doing and the role that will play in this movement to expand the court and court reform as well.
Thank you for that question. Well, first of all, partnering with Brian and demand justice. You would think that justice, which is already exists, but it has never just existed. We've always had to demand that we want and then show what it looks like.
Correct.
So the organization that I am a chairman of the board of is the Drum Major Institute. We have a division or another entity called Drum Majors for Change, which is the political part, because DMI is a nonprofit 501c3, but I'm sorry, Drum Majors for Change is able to do political action. And one of the things in that vein that we're doing is we're working on a campaign. We've identified 40 organizations around the country and swing states, and we are raising $100 million over the next 4 years to re-grant to these organizations that are out here knocking on doors, that are doing educational programs, that are doing prison reform programs. One of the organizations in North Carolina, your neighboring state, just was able to get 55,000 folks back on the rolls who are going to be voting, 55 felons. Now, we know we have some states where felons cannot, if just a few now, cannot ever vote, which is crazy. I mean, you've paid your debt to society and you still can't vote. I mean, that's taxation without representation. So they shouldn't have to pay any taxes if they can't vote, if they've paid their debt to society.
Don't tease me with a good time. I'll go out there and pick up a felony kind of quick if I ain't got to pay no. But an easy one, something slight though. I take your dog and bring it back, something like that.
But let me add this. So these organizations we know are moving the pendulum, and the issue is, if they can focus on what they do and we can provide the funding for them, we will begin to see a difference as it relates to the preservation of democracy and a whole myriad of issues. I mean, we saw the governor of Florida arrest 30 people, a couple whites, maybe more than a couple, but they went to one guy's home. He had received, and all of them, voting cards from the county, whose responsibility it is to monitor whether you can vote or not. And yet the governor went around and arrested people. They arrested one man in his underwear, took him to jail. Now, these people have, number one, they've served time. They've paid their debt. Some of them might have had some resources that they still owed to the state. But that, in my judgment, should not be for people not to be able to vote. They should still be able to vote because they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're trying to make their contribution. And so it's beyond egregious what has been done. And so I guess what I'm saying is I think what we are doing and other organizations that are helping is one of the things that will help transform. And some of these organizations will be willing or are going to be doing some of that educational work at the grassroots level around advancing this action to add more justices to the Supreme Court.
Let me ask you this question for some naysayers out there, and this is when I want you to give a message of hope. Hope I tee it up appropriately. But for people out there who say, look, we've been fighting for voting rights and we still ain't there. And we've been fighting for criminal justice reform and we still ain't there. And hell, y'all asked us to give you a majority in the Senate and we gave you that and we still ain't there. Talk about how we get this issue across the finish line amongst some of those other things. What's the hopeful message that we have to tell people who have been beaten up?
So first of all, I would say that every campaign my father was involved in, very few, if any of them, were sprints. They were marathons. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to look at it, not to say that things are going to just take a long, long time, but it is not a sprint. Our society is instant. We want to see everything instant. Progress doesn't always come instant, but it does come when people are dedicated, determined, and focused. I think that, when you think about it, 1955 was the bus boycott for 385 days.
Correct.
In Montgomery. That's a nice amount of time to boycott every day. It was not until 1964, several years later, that the Civil Rights Act was passed. Voting rights came a little quicker, but yet they were struck down in 2013 by the courts and eviscerated ultimately.
Got it. Yep.
And they're still doing more. They're still trying to do more. That's, again, why the court scenario is so important about expanding the court, because they're trying to decimate voting rights, particularly for the Black and brown community, particularly for students and seniors. Everyone is impacted in this. I think that message clearly is not getting out enough. I forgot the other part of the question you asked me, but
I was just asking you for hope about not just voting rights.
So here's what I would say as it relates to hope. We know the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first steps. We know that we have seen, if we go back and look at history, I mean, look how long it took for Congress to vote around lynching. I mean, all the folks that were killed. And now what they're doing is they've identified some imaginary concept called critical race theory that doesn't need to be taught in schools. I mean, you think about this. In Texas, they use the I have a dream speech to say that the I have a dream speech can't be taught. Dr. King wanted us to be a colorblind society. Yes, he did want us to be, but we ain't there yet. That's the problem. So the fact of the matter is, you would take a speech that is profoundly looked at throughout the world as one of the greatest speeches, and say in Texas, because of critical race theory, which does not exist, it's, as you know, being an attorney, it was designed for law school students.
I don't argue with people about critical race theory because my daddy said you never argue with fools because people watching can't tell the difference. But continue.
But we have to be in front. I agree with you, but we still have to be in front of the issue that is keeping truth from being known.
Correct.
I mean, think about this. After George Floyd, every state in our nation and many countries around the world, almost all, had demonstrations because they could see a policeman being judge, jury, and executioner. Now, most of those demonstrations, by the way, weren't led by Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has been doing all kind of things. And I must say this, because Black Lives Matter is having issues, you can't throw out the good that was done because you got some issues. You got to deal with those issues, but you cannot say and discount what they've done for this nation to advance us. But here's my higher point. The fact of the matter is, when you look at all those demonstrations across the country, many of them were led by young white people. So white folk may have said, okay, well, this black folk demonstration, they always demonstrate. But when their kids were leading these demonstrations, that's when a major thing happened. Now, the other thing is, after every victory, there's always pushback. In 1963, August 28th, March on Washington, 250,000 people, very diverse numbers of people coming together, labor and religious leaders, all kind of people, blacks and whites. And yet, just a few weeks after that, the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed where 4 little girls were killed. So my point is, every time there's a victory, after George Floyd, now we're seeing all this huge pushback, the creation of something called critical race theory that does not exist, not in public primary and secondary education. It doesn't even exist. So there are people who are manufactured to create an issue. And that's what's part of the thing that will tear us apart. And when I said earlier, I was very concerned that people are gunning up and other people are ginning for some kind of new civil war. That's crazy. But the prospect of something happening is real.
I guess my last question to you is, how do we ensure that other civil rights organizations and leaders are involved in this as well? I mean, I know we have some people out here who are probably involved in the Divine Nine, for example, or the NAACP or our local chapters. How do we make sure that they are involved? And this should be a priority in our own communities.
I think building a critical coalition, and I know many are already involved. A number of organizations and Brian and his team have brought a lot of us together, but there's going to be more. I think this is going to be what I don't want to see is another critical decision moving us backward, which is more of a prospect than not. And people have to see things. Sometimes they have to, I'm trying to be in a nonviolent way, but sometimes people have to be slapped upside the head before they realize. Non-violently slapped, not, So, and then we need to do something. No, we need to be doing something. We needed to already be doing something. So that is, I know we're going to see many more coming to the table, but there's so many issues we're dealing with. I mean, right now, our focus has to be maximizing getting the vote out. That really has to be where we're all focused for the midterm election.
I'm going to just end and wrap up where I began, which is to simply say thank you, but not thank you for everything that you have done. I think that's kind of whatever. And I'm not thank you for everything that you are doing, but I think the most important thing is thank you for everything that you will do for us. And I want to say that from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, Brian. And with that, we're going to take a break.